Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is James. I am the creator of the Raven of the Scythe fantasy role playing game, which you can download at drivethroughrpg.com. It's available for free right now. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of fantasy races. Now, fantasy races are a mainstay in fantasy fiction, role playing games, literature, all that stuff. And let me start off by saying that I absolutely love fantasy races. I think they are just the coolest thing. Like, they just fill my little nerd heart with delight. Every time the freaking, you finally fight your way through the horde and you make it to the orc chieftain or the warlord or whatever, and he comes over the hill and he slams his great axe into the ground, and he's looking down at you, and maybe he's got his dire wolf companion there next to him or something like that. Or maybe you've finally made your way down through the catacombs under the city or something, and you found the secret altars and the ritual spaces, and then all of a sudden the hooded cultists they start pulling the hoods back off of their heads, and it turns out that they're not even humans, they're snake people, and they start flicking their tongues at you, and their tails are thrashing around behind them, all agitated, and the DM or whoever is running this starts elongating the S's, because you just have to, because they're snake people, and that's one of the things that make them cool. So these robed snake people, they pull out their poison tipped daggers and they're coming at your party, and the high cultist is now you've discovered our secret lair. Your payment shall be your deaths. That stuff's awesome. I love that stuff. I think that's one of the cooler concepts of fantasy role-playing, whether, it's a pen and paper game or a video game or just whatever. I love that stuff. That's great. Whenever I first started working on Raven of the Scythe, it wasn't even called Raven of the Scythe back then, I had this idea for making a role-playing game that was going to be a very traditional fantasy pen and paper role-playing game, right? It was going to have classes, and it was going to have levels, and there were going to be fantasy races in it. I was really excited about getting to bring these races to life. So, you were going to have humans and dwarves and elves, and there were going to be gnomes, and you could play as centaurs. I was really excited about making a centaur race, and maybe even bird people. I wasn't sold on the idea, but I grew up playing a lot of Shining Force back on the Sega Genesis, and Shining Force had bird people, and that the whole the art style of the game and everything kind of was inspiring what I was wanting to get out of this game. I just wanted it to be a very light sort of, yay, me and my friends are gonna go and have adventures, and oh no, someone opened the tomb and now the elder demon has emerged. But it's all cartoony, and yeah, people might fight or get killed or something like that, but the tone of the game overall was going to be very, very light. And one of the things that I was most excited about was the dwarves, because I think Dragon Age, to some extent the video games, and to a much greater extent the pen and paper role-playing game they published about that, really changed my opinion about dwarves and what you could do with dwarves in a setting like this. And I was going to make it so that, every once in a while, along the road or something, you would come across these little dwarven, farming communities. And there would be little dwarven farmers out, planting and raising pigs and growing crops, and they'd have little storefronts and inns and taverns, or just everyone in these tiny little towns would be dwarves. But you would never really see dwarves on the roads unless they were merchants. And that, I thought, would be kind of a weird little, subtle hint to what was really going on, because all these tiny little dwarven communities and, farmsteads and stuff like that they were going to have were actually going to be connected underground to this massive dwarven kingdom that they had down underground and, under the mountains and stuff. So most people never even would see that, and a lot of people wouldn't even know it was there. But that was my way of trying to explain, well, if dwarves live underground all the time, where are they getting their food, and stuff like that. So the idea of having, sort of satellite surface farms really, really intrigued me, and I was excited to make a game that had these dwarves in it. And, I remember one of my earlier D&D campaigns that I used to run back when I was, 15 or something, I don't know. Way up in the super frozen north, there was a community of elves that lived up there, and they had this giant metropolis city tucked away in this, frozen forest. But the city itself, was built out of amethyst, because I was a teenager and I had just learned what amethyst was, and I thought the idea of making a city out of this gemstone, as if it were just a building material, really, really excited me, and I was intrigued by the concept of it. So, with all that being said, if fantasy races are so cool, why aren't there any in Raven of the Scythe? Why is the default for the game only humans with no option to play elves or dwarves or centaurs or bird people or any of this other stuff? Why did I omit that? And that was actually a really hard decision for me whenever, as, my cartoonish game, I was going to call it Song of Ages, I think was kind of the working title for it, but Song of Ages changed over time and eventually became Raven of the Scythe, which has neither classes nor levels nor fun little fantasy races. Why not, though? And the reason for this goes a lot into world building. So mechanically, races give game designers a lot of cool options. I'm going to be referring to D&D a lot, I think, just because I think just about everyone who plays these types of games is at least somewhat familiar with some edition of Dungeons and Dragons. But by all means, they're not the only ones. The fantasy races gives the game designers a very neat way to express and change the rules of the game. The fact that elves almost always get some kind of bonus to their dexterity because they're so graceful and beautiful and agile, and dwarves get their bonus to their constitution score because they're stocky and hale and hardy and stuff like that. And, what if there's a race that can see in the dark, like elves or dwarves or gnomes or lizard folk or orcs or half elves or anything like that? Or what if there's a race that can, by default, talk to small woodland critters like a forest gnome can? Or, there's all these neat little tweaks you can make to the rules through these fantasy races that, don't necessarily apply to humans. And as a player, that gives you fun things you can do with your characters. If you want to play a woodland gnome because you like the idea of being able to innately speak to little woodland critters, that's cool. And that's a neat thing that could motivate you for your character, to get you excited about playing your character. And if you are a world builder, whoever's running the game or making the world or whatever it is, these fantasy races give you the ability to create, like, very different cultures and stuff like that. But that's really where it kind of starts to fall apart to me, and that has a lot to do with why I didn't include fantasy races in Raven of the Scythe. So, what tends to happen is fantasy races, whether they are elves or orcs or gnomes or halflings, whatever the case may be, they tend to sort of be represented as having a monolithic culture. And even in the lexicon that we use within the hobby, we a lot of times talk about dwarven culture or elvish culture or something like that, and that doesn't necessarily, like, that's such a strange way of expressing a fantasy world. And once I got older and kind of started traveling around a lot more, especially, like, I was in the military for a while, I traveled a lot and got to live on the other side of the world for a few years, and it really, really struck me just how deep culture goes. And it's not to say that, like, well, everything is super different or whatever, like, at the end of the day, we're all still human beings, no matter what culture we come from. But just, unless you've seen it and experienced it or something like that, at least for me, growing up, I rarely left where I had been born, which was the South, Southern United States. But, once you get out and just see, like, how another culture living on the other side of the world has evolved and has changed and is just inherently different from what you might have experienced growing up wherever you're from, it really made me appreciate more than I ever had that these monolithic cultures that we prescribe to fantasy races is such a really silly idea. So, let's say you have, let's go with dwarves, because dwarves are pretty uniform across most fantasy fiction. You have your dwarves, and they have their long beards, and, like, maybe they braid them in, like, these intricate designs, or they put jewelry in them to adorn them, and stuff like that. And that's an important part of dwarvish culture. But then if you take a step back from it and think, well, it doesn't have to be, though. Like, it's literally just a beard. Maybe the dwarves from this one kingdom are really, really into their beards and beard braiding and stuff like that. But maybe the race of dwarves that lives, a few hundred miles away, maybe their kingdom, maybe they don't even grow beards. Maybe they do not care about beards whatsoever. It's just not a part of their thing. And once you start looking at all of the expectations of fantasy races and what niches they're going to feel in the world, like, these monolithic cultures really start to break down. So then what I've seen some games do is, well, you break the races down further. So maybe you have the Iron Dwarves who live in the kingdom of Iron Dwarfia, and they're all about beards. But then you have the Stone Dwarves who live in Stone Dwarfia, and their culture's like this. And, like, usually there's, like, different stats associated with it. Like, okay, so maybe the Iron Dwarves, they get an even higher Constitution bonus and better dark vision. But the Stone Dwarves, they get a bonus to, their wisdom scores, because they're really, really into their religion. So they get a bonus to their wisdom score, but they don't have dark vision because they don't live as deep underground. And that, if you follow that to its logical conclusion, what you essentially end up with is every single race is essentially gets broken down by culture, and this would include humans, and this is one of the parts that bugs me about it, because humans always seem to be exempt from these types of discussions, where it's like, well, how do you represent culture versus race and stuff like that? And then it gets even weirder whenever you start applying human cultures to races of non-humans. And I don't think anybody means anything bad by it or anything like that. It's just a cool way to, make your racial cultures different from each other. So, just think about how many, burly dwarves you see with, their long gray beards and their thick Scottish rolls, all the time, talking about going down to the tavern and drinking their ale, so if the dwarves are Scottish now, what about, I don't know, and ultimately this led me to a type of discussion, with myself, kind of just thinking about the world of Raven of the Scythe and what I wanted it to be like. I decided to not go into races because I wanted the game itself to have a very sort of grayish tapestry to it. So I don't like to call it dark fantasy, but I'm looking at history, and because, a lot of these things are inspired by historical events or historical time periods, that's because, when you talk about castles and swords and dragons and knights and stuff, and the bearded wizards and all that, you're essentially referring to a fantastical version of medieval European whatever, mythology, history, folklore, something. And it's evolved into its own thing, but it's getting its cues from medieval history. And if you look back at medieval history, what you don't find very often are people who are inherently good. And at the same time, you don't necessarily find people who are inherently evil. You find people who do great things. There were some absolutely fantastic people in the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages or the medieval period, or, however you best understand it. There were people who did great things, humanitarianism and, spreading knowledge and, solidifying the world that, we came to inherit. But if you look any further into them as people, you discover that, a lot of them did some really atrocious things. And even people that, traditionally get thought of as oh, well, these are historical villains. These are the very, very bad people. A lot of those people had very redeeming qualities. They were admired, at least by some people, for a reason. And so with Raven of the Scythe, what I wanted to make more possible was a world that could exist in a gray area, where instead of being a game about a conflict between good and evil, I wanted it to be a game about conflicting objectives between people with different ideas. So, in the game I'm running right now, actually, and this won't come out until after the game's over, so the players aren't going to hear it. But in the game that I'm running right now, there is a match accuser, a wizard, who is plotting to overthrow the countess of this place where the players are, because he wants to to get rid of the monarchy and instate a form of government where wizards are in charge, because in his mind, wizards are the smartest, most powerful people in the kingdom, so why shouldn't they be in charge? And the countess in this particular situation happens to be a 14-year-old girl who inherited her power very, very young, obviously. So in his mind, he's an arch wizard. He has studied magic and developed these powers and abilities for years. Why on earth should he listen to or respect the opinion of this 14-year-old girl just because she was born to the ruling family? And you might look at him and like hear his ideas and think, wow, he actually kind of makes a lot of sense, but he just woke up a dragon to terrorize the city and hopefully he's going to be able to control the dragon is what he's trying for, so he can use that increased firepower to defeat the Countess's armies and the people and the soldiers who are loyal to her. And he's going to kill a lot of people to accomplish this goal. So, it just so happened in our game, he's the villain. But in another game, he might very well be one of the heroes. And so how does this relate to fantasy races? Well, traditionally you have, your quote unquote good fantasy races, like your dwarves and your halflings, and especially your elves, because they had to make an entirely new evil sub-race of elves just so they could have evil elves. This is back in the very, very early days of Dungeons and Dragons. When you throw in good and evil races and stuff, that gets very, very harder, or it gets more difficult to establish moral gray areas like that. And then you throw in the evil races, like, and these are your orcs and your goblins and your lizard folk and your snake people and your bird people and your cow people and, whatever your system or your setting happens to include. It creates a setting where, okay, we know that they're bad because they're orcs, and it's a very easy way to abbreviate everything that you need to know about this, whatever conflict, because the antagonists are orcs, and the orcs are bad because they are raiders, and their dark evil orc god has commanded them to come in and squash the races of man. Or maybe they have all fallen sway to the Dark Lord that created them from corrupted elves, and so they're going to do his bidding no matter what. Or whatever the case may be, like whatever the race is, once you set aside an entire race and say, okay, these are the bad guys in my setting, then any conflict with that race becomes very, very simple. And like you can try to add more nuance to it and stuff like that and say like, well, maybe the orcs were driven out of their homeland in this valley where they were living happy, peaceful lives as orcs, and they were driven out by an evil dragon, so they became raiders, and so now you're in conflict with them because they're looking for a new place to settle. But I feel like if you try to establish that level of nuance to it, I feel like you're really sort of making more work for yourself. And also, you're kind of fighting against the tenets of typical fantasy once you start doing stuff like that. Because one of the advantages of having orcs and gnolls and snake people and stuff like that is that it provides you with cannon fodder. Like, you can walk into a 5x5 room with a treasure chest guarded by an orc soldier and slit his throat and not lose a moment's rest over it. Like, you're like, okay, one less orc in the world, moving on. And either that's incredibly simple in the sense of like, okay, well, we have established that orcs are so inherently evil that we can literally murder them to take their stuff without any moral or social repercussions from it. Or what if you created a situation where, you just went through this place and killed all these orcs and took all their stuff. And then, because, you're thinking, well, it's a typical fantasy world and the orcs are bad, so let's start killing things for their stuff. And then you find out later on that, these orcs are actually they're the proud noble orcs. And they're not really bad. But you just killed like 30 of them last week. That creates a little bit of a complication with the world building and with the storytelling that I decided was best avoided altogether. So in Raven of the Scythe, you will when you encounter an intelligent, plotting enemy that's not just some sort of natural hazard or something like that, like, an animal that just happens to be naturally aggressive, because that's a completely different type of encounter that can be dealt with a lot of ways. But when you're dealing with a thinking, living, sentient being with, a culture and stuff like that, and language and, histories and stuff like that, I wanted there to be a sort of moral ambiguity about it. And for me, because I am trying to rely on the tropes of fantasy fiction and fantasy role-playing games, I think that the best, easiest, and most consistent way to accomplish that was saying that there are no good races of elves and dwarves and gnomes and dragonborn or whatever, and there are no bad races of orcs and goblins and gnolls and whatever else. There are just people trying to accomplish goals. And sometimes those goals come into conflict with each other, and that's whenever, as the player characters involved in these stories, that's the point when they need to decide, okay, well, which one are we on the side of? Which goal are we most in line with? And go from there. I think that creates a more nuanced and complex tapestry than just making every conflict about good versus evil. And that's why whenever I finally made Raven of the Scythe, I had to abandon the idea that I was going to include fantasy races in this game. And also one other thing about that. One other thing. When you think about a civilization and what a civilization needs to support and sustain itself, it gets really, really weird to think like, okay, let's go with goblins. So goblins, traditionally small, evil humanoids that are sometimes annoying because they gather in large numbers and can attack communities, or because they can fall under the service of other more powerful evil creatures. If you have a population, a very large population, because goblins always have large populations, otherwise what's the point of using goblins? If you have a very large population of goblins, what on earth are they eating? Where are they getting their clothes? Where are they getting their weapons? Are they stealing all of this? Like, was there enough arms and armor to equip an entire horde of goblins that may number several hundred out of a community that's maybe less than 100? Like, where are these goblins getting their food from? Like, are there goblin farmers somewhere? Like, are there little goblins with straw hats, like, tending to pigs and stuff like that, and, selling goblin pork at the local market to the goblin blacksmith who's making weapons to supply the horde with what they need? And you can say, like, oh, well, they just raid and they steal and they improvise and they've been doing this for a long time, so there's a lot of, like, old, passed down, like, weapons that aren't in that good of shape, but that's what they have, so that's what they still use and stuff like that. Or maybe whatever Dark Lord is controlling them is supplying them. I think that gets a little bit silly after a while. And because just the logistics of it, the same reason why I thought of the idea with the dwarves having the satellite farms, because you can't grow that amount of food underground. With Raven of the Scythe, since I wanted it to be a more grounded fantasy, I decided to try to avoid as many of those types of areas where you might have to suspend your disbelief as I could. And that's why in Raven of the Scythe, you don't typically, there are a few exceptions, a very, very few exceptions, but you don't run into this dichotomy of these are the good races because they're in the player's handbook, and these are the bad races because they're in the monster book. At least, those were my thoughts on the subject, and this video is already getting a little bit long, so I think I've made my point. If you have any questions or whatever, please feel free to let me know in the comments below if you've got any ideas for any other topics you would like me to cover related to Raven of the Scythe, fantasy role-playing games, world building, game design, whatever. Also let me know. And also, like, if you like the idea of fantasy races and want to include them in Raven of the Scythe, you have my full support and permission to do so. Not that you need either of them, obviously, but I would love to hear about what the elves or the tieflings or whatever in your Raven of the Scythe games end up looking like. So if this is something you've done, let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to hear about it. And with that, I think I'm going to end this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day.